Sarah Martinez had seen it all during her 12 years as a trauma nurse at Metro General Hospital. Gang violence, domestic abuse, overdoses, and accidents filled her nights with blood, tears, and desperate families. But nothing had prepared her for the night when her own past would collide with her present in the most violent way possible. The emergency room buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. 3 ambulances had arrived within the past hour, bringing in victims from a multi-car accident on the highway. Sarah moved between patients with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she started IVs, checked vital signs, and assisted the doctors. Her colleagues often commented on her unusual calmness under pressure, but they had no idea where that composure came from. At 34, Sarah appeared to be just another dedicated nurse. Average height, brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind eyes that had seen too much pain. She drove a modest Honda Civic, lived in a small apartment, and spent her free time reading or hiking. Her coworkers knew she had served in the military before becoming a nurse, but Sarah never talked about those years. She preferred to keep that part of her life buried deep. What they didn't know was that Petty Officer Sarah Martinez had been one of only a handful of women to complete the grueling Navy SEAL training program during a classified pilot program 8 years earlier. The program had been quietly discontinued after political pressure, and its participants were reassigned to other special operations units or discharged. Sarah had chosen to leave the military entirely, seeking a different way to serve others. The training had changed her in ways that went beyond physical conditioning. She could remain calm in situations that would terrify most people. Her reflexes were lightning fast, and her mind could assess threats and plan responses in seconds. But she had also learned to suppress these abilities to blend in with civilian life. Most of the time, she succeeded in appearing completely ordinary. Tonight started like any other. Sarah was working the night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. in the trauma bay. The accident victims were stabilizing, and she was updating charts when the automatic doors burst open. 3 men stumbled in, supporting a 4th who was bleeding heavily from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the leg. The injured man was conscious but clearly in pain, cursing loudly as his friends helped him to a wheelchair. Sarah quickly assessed the situation and approached them with a trauma kit. The bleeding wasn't life-threatening, but it needed immediate attention. "Sir, I need you to lie down so I can examine the wound," Sarah said calmly, gesturing toward an empty bed. The injured man looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. Marcus Tank Rodriguez was well known to the hospital staff, though Sarah had never treated him personally. He was a local drug dealer with a reputation for violence and a long criminal record. His street name came from his massive build and his tendency to bulldoze through any obstacle, human or otherwise. "I ain't lying down for some nurse," Tank snarled, his voice slurred by pain and whatever substances were in his system. "Give me a real doctor." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. "The doctor will see you shortly, but I need to stop this bleeding first. Hospital protocol requires." "I don't care about your protocol," Tank shouted, attempting to stand up from the wheelchair. "You think you can tell me what to do?" His friends tried to calm him down, clearly nervous about causing a scene in a hospital. But Tank was beyond reason, fueled by pain, drugs, and a lifetime of using intimidation to get his way. Sarah stepped back slightly, giving him space while keeping her voice level. "Sir, I understand you're in pain. Let me help you." "Stay down, lady," Tank growled, and without warning, his boot connected with Sarah's chest. The kick sent her stumbling backward into a medical cart, instruments scattering across the floor. The force would have knocked most people down completely, but Sarah managed to stay on her feet, though just barely. Her training had taught her how to absorb impact and maintain balance even when caught off guard. The trauma bay fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Other nurses and a security guard who had been dealing with paperwork nearby froze in shock. Tank's friends looked horrified, realizing their companion had just assaulted a hospital employee. Sarah straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her chest where his boot had connected. She could feel the beginnings of what would be a massive bruise, but nothing was broken. Her breathing remained steady, controlled. For a moment, she closed her eyes and fought against the surge of muscle memory that wanted to take over. 8 years of civilian life. 8 years of choosing compassion over combat. 8 years of healing instead of fighting. But as she opened her eyes and saw Tank laughing at what he had done, something deep inside her shifted. "That's what happens when you don't show respect," Tank said loudly, playing to an audience of shocked medical staff. "Maybe next time you'll remember your place." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward. "Sir," she said quietly, "you made a mistake." Tank seemed confused by her calm response. He had expected her to cower, to call for security, to run. Instead, this ordinary-looking nurse was walking toward him with the kind of confidence he usually only saw in other predators. "What did you say to me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I said you made a mistake," Sarah repeated, stopping just outside his reach. "I was trying to help you as a patient. Now I'm going to help you as someone who needs to learn about consequences." Something in her voice made Tank's friends take several steps back. There was a quality to it that spoke of authority, of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. The security guard reached for his radio, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head slightly. Tank tried to stand again, using his good leg to push himself up from the wheelchair. He was easily 6'4" and weighed close to 300 pounds. Sarah was 5'6" and maybe 140 soaking wet. To any observer, it looked like David facing Goliath, except this David had been trained by the most elite warriors in the world. "You think you're tough now?" Tank laughed, swaying slightly as he found his balance. "I eat little girls like you for breakfast." Sarah's response was so quiet that only Tank and those immediately nearby could hear it. "The last person who kicked me ended up in a body bag. But you're in a hospital, so you'll just end up in the ICU." For the first time, Tank seemed to register that something was very wrong with this situation. This nurse wasn't acting like a victim. She wasn't calling for help or backing down. Instead, she stood perfectly still, balanced on the balls of her feet in a way that suggested she was ready for whatever came next. But Tank had built his reputation on never backing down from anyone, especially not some medical worker who probably made less in a year than he did in a month. His pride wouldn't let him walk away, even as his instincts started screaming warnings. "You threatening me?" he demanded, taking a menacing step toward her. "No," Sarah said simply. "I'm giving you a chance to sit back down, and let me treat your wound. After that, you can leave, and we'll both forget this happened." Tank's friends were pulling at his arms now, urging him to take the offer and go. They could sense the change in the atmosphere, the way the other hospital staff had gone completely silent. Even they knew Tank well enough to recognize when he was about to make a catastrophically bad decision. But Tank had never backed down from anyone in his life, and he wasn't about to start with a nurse who barely came up to his shoulder. "I'm going to teach you some respect," he said, raising his hand to strike her. That's when Sarah moved. Years of suppressed training exploded into action in the space of a heartbeat. Her left hand caught Tank's wrist before his blow could land, her grip precise and unbreakable. Her right hand struck his elbow joint with surgical precision, hyperextending it just enough to cause intense pain without permanent damage. Tank's roar of surprise and agony echoed through the trauma bay as Sarah smoothly stepped to his side, using his own momentum against him. Her leg swept behind his injured one, and suddenly all 300 pounds of Tank Rodriguez was airborne. He hit the floor with a crash that rattled the entire room. Before he could even process what had happened, Sarah was kneeling beside him, one knee pressed against his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult, her hand controlling his injured leg with a grip that sent lightning bolts of pain through his entire body. "I gave you a chance," she said quietly, her voice still perfectly calm. "Now you're going to lie still while I stop your bleeding, and then you're going to leave quietly." If you move, if you speak, if you even look at me wrong, I will demonstrate why the Navy spent 2 years teaching me creative ways to disable people. Tank tried to speak, but the pressure on his throat made it impossible. He tried to move, but Sarah's positioning was perfect. Any attempt to shift his weight sent waves of agony through his wounded leg. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Tank Rodriguez was completely helpless. The silence in the trauma bay was broken only by the sound of Tank's labored breathing and the soft shuffle of Sarah's shoes as she adjusted her position. The other nurses, the security guard, Tank's friends, everyone stared in stunned disbelief as this ordinary-looking woman held a notorious criminal completely immobilized with what appeared to be minimal effort. Dr. Jennifer Chun, the attending physician, chose that moment to walk into the trauma bay. She stopped short when she saw Sarah kneeling over a man who was clearly not a typical patient. "Sarah, Dr. Chun said carefully. Is everything all right?" Sarah looked up without releasing her hold on Tank. "This gentleman has a gunshot wound to his left thigh. Non-life-threatening, but needs cleaning and suturing. He also has some behavioral issues that I've addressed." Dr. Chin had worked with Sarah for 3 years and had never seen her so much as raise her voice. Now she was restraining what looked like a very dangerous man with the kind of professional competence that suggested this wasn't her first time. "Should I call security?" Dr. Chin asked. "No need," Sarah replied. "Mr. Rodriguez and I have come to an understanding. Haven't we, sir?" She eased the pressure on Tank's throat just enough for him to speak. He managed a strangled yes before she resumed the previous pressure. "Excellent," Sarah continued. "Now I'm going to get up and get a suture kit. You're going to remain exactly where you are until I come back. Then you're going to lie very still while I fix your leg. After that, you and your friends are going to leave and never come back. Do you understand?" Another strangled yes. Sarah stood smoothly, her movements controlled and precise. Tank remained on the floor, apparently unwilling to test whether she would make good on her implied threats. His friends stood frozen, clearly unsure whether they should help him up or run. As Sarah gathered supplies from the medical cart, Dr. Chun approached her quietly. "Sarah, I've never seen anything like that." "Where did you learn military training?" Sarah said simply, not looking up from the suture kit she was preparing. "Sometimes the past comes in handy." She returned to where Tank lay on the floor, still motionless. With the same calm efficiency she brought to every medical procedure, she began cleaning and treating his wound. Tank flinched at her touch, but didn't dare move. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the choice she had made years ago to leave her old life behind. She had wanted to heal people, not hurt them. She had wanted to save lives, not take them. But tonight had reminded her that sometimes those skills from her past could serve a different purpose. The wound was actually worse than it had initially appeared. The bullet had nicked an artery, and Tank was losing more blood than she had realized. If he had continued to resist treatment much longer, he might have bled out in the emergency room. "You're lucky," she told him as she worked. 5 more minutes, and you would have been in serious trouble." Tank said nothing, but she could see the understanding in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that this woman had probably saved his life, even after he had attacked her. When the suturing was complete, Sarah applied a pressure bandage and helped Tank to his feet. He swayed slightly, but managed to stay upright with the assistance of his friends. "Change the bandage daily," she instructed, handing him a packet of supplies. "Come back if you see any signs of infection. And, sir," Tank looked at her warily, "if you ever lay a hand on another hospital employee, I will find out. And next time, I won't be nearly so gentle." Tank nodded quickly, his earlier bravado completely gone. He and his friends hurried out of the trauma bay without another word, leaving behind only the scattered medical supplies and the memory of what they had witnessed. Dr. Chun and the other staff members gradually returned to their duties, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she cleaned up the mess from the medical cart. She knew there would be questions, reports to file, possibly even an investigation. But as she worked, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since leaving the military, she had used her training for something other than violence. She had used it to protect herself and others, to maintain order in a place dedicated to healing. The night shift continued, and Sarah returned to her regular duties. But she knew that something fundamental had changed. The careful wall she had built between her past and present had crumbled, and there was no going back. As dawn approached and her shift neared its end, Sarah received word that the hospital administrator wanted to see her before she left. She wasn't surprised. Incidents like this didn't go unnoticed, especially when they involve someone with Tank's reputation. She made her way to the administrative offices, her mind already working through how she would explain what had happened. She had spent 8 years hiding her past, living as an ordinary person. Now that was over. But as she walked through the quiet hospital corridors in the early morning light, Sarah realized she wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she felt completely herself. Not just a nurse, not just a former SEAL, but someone who could be both when the situation demanded it. The question now was what came next. The hospital administrator's office felt smaller than Sarah remembered as she sat across from Helen Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s who had run Metro General with an iron fist for the past decade. Between them on the desk was a thick folder containing security footage stills, witness statements, and Tank Rodriguez's medical records. "I've been reviewing the incident report from last night," Helen said, her voice carefully neutral. "It makes for interesting reading." Sarah remained silent, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned long ago that saying too much too quickly was rarely helpful in situations like this. Helen picked up one of the security camera photos. It showed the moment when Tank's foot connected with Sarah's chest, her body already moving to absorb the impact. The security footage is quite clear about who initiated the violence. "Mr. Rodriguez assaulted you without provocation." She set down that photo and picked up another one. This image captured the moment when Sarah had Tank on the ground, her knee positioned precisely at his throat. "What's less clear is your response. Dr. Chun described your actions as professionally controlled neutralization of a threat." Those aren't words she would normally use to describe a nurse restraining a patient. Sarah met Helen's gaze steadily. "I did what was necessary to protect myself and provide medical care to a patient who was refusing treatment." "Yes, about that," Helen said, opening the folder wider. "I had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Chin this morning. She mentioned that your technique was unlike anything she had seen in 20 years of emergency medicine. She also said that Mr. Rodriguez's wound was more serious than initially assessed, and that your quick action likely prevented him from bleeding out." Helen leaned back in her chair. "I've also had several calls this morning. 3 from board members who saw the security footage and want to know why we have a nurse who can single-handedly subdue a man twice her size. 1 from the police, asking if we want to press charges. And 1 very interesting call from someone who identified himself as Admiral Marcus Webb." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She hadn't heard that name in 8 years, but Admiral Webb had been the commanding officer who oversaw her final assignment before leaving the Navy. "The Admiral was quite insistent that I understand the nature of your military service," Helen continued. "He didn't provide details, but he made it clear that you were involved in classified operations and that your training was far beyond what most service members receive." Helen closed the folder and studied Sarah's face. "So, I'm going to ask you directly, Nurse Martinez, what exactly did you do in the Navy?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue to deflect, provide only the minimum information required. Or she could trust Helen with the truth, knowing that it might change everything about her life at the hospital. "I was a Navy SEAL," Sarah said finally. "Part of a classified pilot program to integrate women into special operations units." Helen's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "And you've been working here for 3 years without mentioning this because I wanted to leave that life behind," Sarah said. "I joined the military to serve my country, but After 8 years in special operations, I wanted to serve people in a different way. Medicine seemed like a natural transition, from killing people to healing them. Sarah winced at the bluntness of the question. It's more complicated than that. Special operations isn't just about combat. We were trained to adapt to any situation, to solve complex problems under extreme pressure. Those skills translate to emergency medicine more than you might think. Helen was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing this information. Finally, she leaned forward. Sarah, in the 15 years I've been running this hospital, I've never had a nurse single-handedly neutralize a violent criminal. I've never had someone with your background working in my emergency department. And I've never had a situation that so clearly demonstrated both the potential benefits and risks of having someone with your capabilities on staff. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Are you firing me? On the contrary, Helen said, surprising her. I'm promoting you. Sarah blinked. I'm sorry, what? Helen opened her desk drawer and pulled out another folder. We've been having increasing problems with violence in the emergency department. Gang members, drug dealers, domestic abusers. People like Tank Rodriguez who think they can intimidate our staff into giving them special treatment or overlooking their criminal activities. She opened the new folder, revealing statistics and incident reports. Last year alone, we had 43 documented cases of patients or their associates threatening, intimidating, or physically assaulting hospital staff. Security response time averages 8 minutes, which is far too long when someone is actively being attacked. Helen looked up at Sarah. I've been trying to convince the board to approve funding for additional security measures, but they keep citing budget constraints. What happened last night demonstrated something I've been arguing for years, that our current security protocols are inadequate. Sarah was beginning to understand where this was heading. You want me to help improve security? I want you to develop and lead a new program, Helen said. You'll retain your nursing duties, but you'll also serve as our emergency department security liaison. Your job will be to train our staff in de-escalation techniques, develop better protocols for handling violent patients, and serve as a backup when security isn't immediately available. Sarah stared at her. You want me to teach nurses how to fight? I want you to teach our staff how to protect themselves and their patients, Helen corrected. The goal isn't to turn our medical staff into warriors. It's to give them the tools and confidence they need to handle dangerous situations until proper security can arrive. Helen pulled out a piece of paper from the folder. The board approved the position this morning, along with a 20% salary increase and a budget for equipment and training materials. Interested, Sarah felt her mind racing. This wasn't something she had ever considered. She had assumed that revealing her background would end her nursing career, not expand it. What exactly would this program involve? That's largely up to you, Helen said. I'm thinking basic self-defense training, situational awareness, de-escalation techniques. Maybe some specialized training for staff who work in high-risk areas like the emergency department and psychiatric ward. Helen leaned forward. Sarah, what happened last night could have ended very differently. Tank Rodriguez has been arrested 17 times for assault. He once put a paramedic in the hospital for 3 weeks. If you hadn't been able to defend yourself and control the situation, we might be having a very different conversation right now. Sarah thought about her colleagues, young nurses fresh out of school, older staff members who had dedicated their careers to healing, but had never learned to protect themselves. She thought about Dr. Chun, barely 5 feet tall and probably weighing 90 pounds soaking wet. What would have happened if Tank had turned his violence on her instead? I'll need to design the curriculum carefully, Sarah said slowly. The goal has to be protection and de-escalation, not confrontation. Medical staff should never be put in a position where they have to choose between their safety and their oath to help patients. Agreed, Helen said. We're not trying to militarize the hospital. We just want our people to feel safe while they do their jobs. Sarah nodded. I'll need to review all the incident reports from the past year, identify the most common types of threats our staff face. The training will need to be scenario-based, practical rather than theoretical. You'll have access to everything you need, Helen assured her. When can you start? I'm working tonight, but I could begin developing the program tomorrow, Sarah said. How quickly do you want this implemented? Yesterday, Helen said with a slight smile. But realistically, I'd like to see a preliminary program ready for testing within 2 weeks. If it works well, we'll roll it out hospital-wide. Sarah stood to leave, but Helen called her name. Sarah, one more thing. What you did last night, that wasn't just training. That was someone who cared enough about this place and these people to put herself at risk to protect them. Don't lose that as you develop this program. As Sarah left the administrative offices, she felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. For 8 years, she had been hiding a fundamental part of who she was. Now she was being asked to integrate that hidden aspect of herself with her chosen profession in a way she had never imagined possible. Her first stop was the hospital's medical library, where she began researching workplace violence in healthcare settings. The statistics were sobering. Healthcare workers were 5 times more likely to experience workplace violence than other professions. Emergency departments had the highest rates of violent incidents, followed closely by psychiatric wards. She spent the afternoon reviewing incident reports from Metro General's files. The pattern was distressingly familiar. Intoxicated patients who became aggressive when asked to follow medical protocols. Gang members who tried to intimidate staff into providing preferential treatment. Domestic abusers who followed their victims to the hospital and threatened anyone who tried to help them. In most cases, the hospital staff had responded exactly as they were trained, by calling security and trying to de-escalate verbally until help arrived. But 8-minute response times were an eternity when someone was actively being attacked. Several staff members had been injured, and at least 2 had left the profession entirely after traumatic incidents. As she worked, Sarah began to formulate a training program that would address the specific needs of medical professionals. It couldn't be anything like military training, which was designed to neutralize enemies. Instead, it needed to focus on protection, escape, and maintaining the therapeutic relationship even in dangerous situations. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Chun. Heard about your new position. Want to grab coffee after my shift? I have some ideas you might find interesting. Sarah smiled and typed back her agreement. Dr. Chun had been one of her strongest advocates during her time at Metro General, and her perspective on the violence problem would be invaluable. They met at a small cafe near the hospital, and Dr. Chun dove straight into the subject. I've been thinking about last night since it happened. Not just the incident itself, but what it revealed about the gaps in our current protocols. Dr. Chun stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Sarah, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years. I've seen good people leave the profession because they didn't feel safe at work. I've seen nurses who were afraid to work night shifts because of the increased risk of violent incidents. She looked up at Sarah. What you did last night wasn't just self-defense. You protected everyone in that trauma bay, including Tank's friends who looked terrified when they realized what kind of situation they were in. But more than that, you maintained your professionalism throughout. You still treated as wound. You still provided medical care to someone who had just assaulted you. Sarah nodded. That's what we're trained to do as nurses. Put the patient's well-being first, regardless of personal feelings. Exactly, Dr. Chen said. And that's what makes this training program so important. It's not about turning medical staff into fighters. It's about giving them the confidence and skills to maintain that professional standard even when they're afraid. Dr. Chen leaned forward. I've been talking to some of the other staff about what they witnessed. Do you know what impressed them most? It wasn't the physical techniques you used. It was the fact that you never lost control. You were calm, professional, and proportionate in your response. That's what they need to learn. She was right, Sarah realized. The physical techniques were only part of the equation. The mental discipline, the ability to remain focused and professional under extreme stress. Those were skills that could benefit every member of the medical staff, regardless of their physical capabilities. I want to help you develop this program, Dr. Chen continued. From a medical perspective, from a practical implementation standpoint, from whatever angle you need. This could change how healthcare workers approach their own safety. As they continued to discuss the program, Sarah felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about preventing incidents like the one with Tank Rodriguez. It was about empowering healthcare workers to feel confident and secure in their ability to provide care, even in dangerous situations. Her phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was immediately familiar. Petty Officer Martinez? This is Admiral Webb. Sarah felt her breath catch. Admiral, it's good to hear from you, sir. I heard about your situation at the hospital. I hope you don't mind, but I thought it was important to make sure your civilian employers understood the nature of your service record. Thank you, sir. That was helpful. Sarah, I'm calling because I have a proposition for you. Are you familiar with the Veterans Administration's new healthcare security initiative? Sarah wasn't, and she said so. It's a pilot program designed to address the increasing violence in VA medical facilities. They're looking for people with both medical training and security backgrounds to develop and implement new safety protocols. Your name came up during the selection process. Admiral Webb paused. The position would be based here in Washington, but it would involve travel to VA facilities nationwide. The goal is to create a standardized approach to healthcare security that could eventually be adopted by civilian hospitals as well. Sarah looked across the table at Dr. Chun, who was listening intently to her side of the conversation. Admiral, I appreciate the offer, but I've built a life here. I have responsibilities. I understand, and I'm not asking for an immediate answer. But, Sarah, what you're doing at that hospital, it's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need on a national level. Think about how many healthcare workers you could help if this program were implemented nationwide. After she hung up, Dr. Chin looked at her expectantly. Well, that sounded important. Sarah explained the offer, and Dr. Chan was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. Sarah, as much as I would hate to lose you, that sounds like an incredible opportunity. I don't want to leave Metro General, Sarah said. This is where I belong. Maybe, Dr. Chin said. Or maybe this is where you're supposed to start, and that position is where you're supposed to go next. As Sarah drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about the crossroads she faced. 3 days ago, she had been just another nurse, content to blend into the background and do her job quietly. Now she was being asked to step into leadership roles that would put her military background front and center. But as she thought about Tank Rodriguez, about the fear she had seen in her colleagues' eyes, about all the healthcare workers who had been injured or traumatized by workplace violence, she realized that hiding her capabilities wasn't just a personal choice anymore. It was a decision that affected other people's safety and well-being. For the first time in 8 years, Sarah began to seriously consider whether the time had come to stop hiding from who she was and start using her unique background to make a real difference in the lives of others. The question was no longer whether she could be both a healer and a protector. The question was whether she was ready to accept the responsibility that came with being both. 2 weeks after the incident with Tank Rodriguez, Sarah stood in front of 30 healthcare workers in Metro General's largest conference room. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and even some administrative staff had volunteered for the first pilot session of what the hospital was calling the Personal Safety and Professional Response Program. Sarah had spent every free moment developing the curriculum, consulting with experts in psychology, conflict resolution, and workplace safety. She had also reached out to other hospitals facing similar challenges, gathering data on what worked and what didn't in existing programs. The result was something entirely new. A training system that combined situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, basic self-defense, and trauma-informed care principles. But, standing in front of her colleagues, Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nerves that reminded her of her first day of SEAL training. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite her internal anxiety. "I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. 2 weeks ago, I physically restrained a violent patient in our trauma bay. Some of you witnessed it, others have heard about it, and all of you are probably wondering what qualifies a nurse to teach personal safety." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a simple mission statement. Our goal is to ensure that every healthcare worker feels confident and secure in their ability to provide excellent patient care, regardless of the circumstances. I'm not here to teach you how to fight, Sarah continued. I'm here to teach you how to think, how to recognize potential threats before they escalate, and how to protect yourselves and your patients while maintaining the highest standards of medical care. Dr. Chun, sitting in the front row, nodded encouragingly. She had become Sarah's closest collaborator in developing the program, providing medical context and helping to ensure that all techniques were compatible with healthcare protocols. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about healthcare workplace violence. Every day, healthcare workers face a higher risk of workplace violence than police officers or security guards. But unlike those professions, we're not trained to handle threatening situations. We're trained to heal, to comfort, and to put patients' needs before our own safety. She paused, looking around the room. This program doesn't change that fundamental commitment. Instead, it gives you tools to maintain that commitment, even when you're facing someone who might want to hurt you. The first part of the training focused on situational awareness, learning to read body language, recognize signs of agitation or intoxication, and identify potential weapons or escape routes. Sarah had adapted techniques from her military training, but simplified them for healthcare environments. Violence rarely happens without warning signs, Sarah explained as she demonstrated different stances and postures that indicated aggressive intent. The key is learning to recognize these signs early enough to take preventive action. She called up Maria Santos, a young nurse who had been working in the emergency department for less than a year. Maria, I want you to approach this patient, Sarah said, gesturing to a volunteer playing an agitated patient. But first, tell me what you observe about his body position, his hands, his facial expression. Maria studied the volunteer carefully. He's clenched his fists. His shoulders are tense. He's not making eye contact, but he keeps looking toward the exit. Excellent, Sarah said. What do those signs tell you about his mental state? He's angry, but also scared. Maybe feeling trapped. Right. So how should you approach him? Maria thought for a moment. Keep my distance. Don't block his path to the exit. Keep my voice calm and non-threatening. The exercise continued with the volunteer becoming increasingly agitated, but Maria was able to recognize the escalation early and call for backup before the situation became dangerous. This is the foundation of everything we do, Sarah explained to the group. Prevention through awareness. If you can identify a potentially dangerous situation early, you can often defuse it before anyone gets hurt. The second part of the training focused on de-escalation techniques specifically adapted for healthcare settings. Sarah had worked with Dr. Chun to develop scenarios that were realistic and relevant to their daily work. Remember, our patients are often afraid, in pain, or under the influence of substances that affect their judgment, Sarah said. Their aggression usually isn't personal. It's a response to circumstances they can't control. She demonstrated various verbal techniques for calming agitated patients, showing how body language, tone of voice, and word choice could either escalate or defuse tense situations. The goal is always to maintain the therapeutic relationship, Dr. Chen added during one exercise. Even when someone is threatening you, they're still your patient, and they still deserve your professional care. The third section of the training was the most controversial: basic physical self-defense techniques adapted for healthcare workers. Sarah had been careful to focus on escape and protection rather than confrontation. These techniques are a last resort, she emphasized repeatedly. Your primary goal is always to get away safely and call for help. These moves are designed to create an opportunity to escape, not to subdue or punish anyone. She taught simple wrist releases for situations where someone grabbed a healthcare worker's arm or clothing. She showed how to break free from bear hugs or choke holds using leverage rather than strength. Most importantly, she taught them how to fall safely and how to protect vital areas if knocked down. The average security response time in this hospital is 8 minutes, Sarah reminded them. That's 8 minutes you need to keep yourself and your patient safe. These techniques might buy you the time you need until help arrives. During the lunch break, several participants approached Sarah with questions and feedback. Tom Harrison, a veteran nurse from the ICU, seemed particularly thoughtful. "Sarah, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've always just hoped that nothing bad would happen to me," he said. "This morning is the first time I've felt like I had some control over that outcome." Rebecca Walsh, a young nurse from the pediatric ward, was more skeptical. "I understand the theory, but I'm worried about how this looks to patients and families. Are we militarizing healthcare?" It was a valid concern, one that Sarah had wrestled with throughout the development process. "Rebecca, do you wear gloves when you handle bodily fluids?" "Of course." "Do patients think you're afraid of them because you take universal precautions?" "No, they understand it's for everyone's safety." "This is the same principle," Sarah explained. "We're taking reasonable precautions to ensure that we can continue to provide excellent care in all circumstances. A nurse who feels safe and confident is better equipped to help patients than one who's constantly worried about their own security." The afternoon session focused on applying the morning's lessons to specific scenarios. Sarah had created detailed case studies based on real incidents from Metro General's files, changing details to protect privacy, but maintaining the essential elements that made each situation challenging. The first scenario involved a domestic violence victim whose abuser had followed her to the hospital and was demanding to see her. The second dealt with an intoxicated patient who became aggressive when informed that he would need to wait several hours for treatment. The third scenario was the most complex, a gang member who had been brought in with a gunshot wound and whose associates were intimidating staff to ensure he received immediate attention. Each scenario required participants to integrate all the skills they had learned: situational awareness to assess the threat level, de-escalation techniques to calm the situation, and physical techniques as a last resort if other measures failed. "The key is to have a plan before you need one," Sarah explained as groups worked through the scenarios. "Think about exits, allies, and options. Don't wait until you're in danger to figure out how to respond." Dr. Angela Rodriguez, the chief of psychiatry, raised a concern that several others had been thinking about. "Sarah, what about patients with mental health conditions? How do we balance compassion and understanding with the need for safety?" It was a crucial question. Sarah had consulted with psychiatric nurses and mental health professionals while developing this part of the curriculum. "Mental illness doesn't automatically make someone violent," Sarah said. "Most patients with psychiatric conditions pose no threat to anyone. But when someone is experiencing a psychotic episode or is severely intoxicated, they may not respond to normal de-escalation techniques." She clicked to a slide showing modified approaches for different mental health conditions. The principles remain the same: awareness, de-escalation, protection. But the implementation might be different. Someone experiencing paranoid delusions might perceive normal gestures as threatening. So we need to adapt our body language and communication style. She demonstrated techniques for approaching patients who might be experiencing hallucinations or delusions, showing how to validate their experience without reinforcing dangerous beliefs. "Remember, your safety and the safety of other patients is always the priority," Sarah said. "You can't help anyone if you're injured. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is to step back and wait for additional resources." As the day progressed, Sarah watched her colleagues transform from skeptical and nervous to engaged and empowered. She saw Tom Harrison practicing wrist releases with a confidence she had never seen in him before. She watched Rebecca Walsh work through a domestic violence scenario with newfound assertiveness. But it was Dr. Chen's reaction that meant the most to her. During one of the final exercises, a participant asked Dr. Chen how she felt about the program. "This morning, I was the doctor who weighed 90 pounds and hoped that security would always be available when I needed them," Dr. Chen said. "This afternoon, I'm still that same doctor, but I also know that I have options. I know how to recognize trouble before it starts, how to position myself safely, and how to respond if someone tries to hurt me or my patients. She looked directly at Sarah. This program doesn't change who we are as healthcare providers. It just makes us more complete healthcare providers. As the formal training session ended, Helen Morrison appeared in the doorway. The hospital administrator had been observing the final hour of the program, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Helen asked Sarah. They stepped into the hallway, where Helen's serious expression broke into a smile. "Sarah, that was remarkable. I've never seen our staff so engaged with the training program." She held up a tablet showing evaluation scores from the participants. Every single person rated the training as extremely valuable or very valuable. More importantly, they all said they felt more confident about handling difficult situations. Helen's expression grew more serious. "I've been talking with the board about expanding this program. We want to implement it hospital-wide within the next month. But, Sarah, I need to ask, are you sure you're ready for this level of visibility?" It was a good question. This morning, Sarah had been nervous about training 30 people. If the program expanded hospital-wide, she would be responsible for training nearly 800 staff members. More than that, she would inevitably attract attention from outside the hospital, professional organizations, medical journals, other hospitals looking to implement similar programs. "I think about the alternative," Sarah said finally. "How many more Tank Rodriguez's are out there? How many healthcare workers are going to be hurt because they don't know how to protect themselves? How many patients are going to suffer because their caregivers are too scared to do their jobs effectively?" She looked back through the conference room window, where small groups of staff members were still practicing techniques and discussing scenarios. "I can't protect everyone, but I can give them tools to protect themselves. That feels like a responsibility I can't walk away from." Helen nodded. "Good, because I just got off the phone with the chief medical officer at Presbyterian Hospital across town. They want to send a team to observe our program next week. And the State Hospital Association has asked if you would be willing to present at their annual conference next month." Sarah felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. The quiet life she had built for herself was definitely over. But as she watched her colleagues continue to practice and learn, she realized that might not be such a bad thing. "There's one more thing," Helen said. "Admiral Webb called again this morning. He wanted to know if you had given any more thought to that position in Washington." Sarah had been trying not to think about the Admiral's offer. The opportunity to develop healthcare security protocols on a national level was incredibly appealing, but it would mean leaving Metro General just as this program was getting started. "I told him you were busy transforming how healthcare workers think about their own safety," Helen continued. "He said that's exactly what convinced him you were the right person for the Washington position." Helen handed Sarah a business card. "He's going to be in town next week for a conference. He'd like to meet with you to discuss the details. No commitment required, just a conversation about possibilities." As Sarah took the card, she realized that her carefully controlled civilian life was evolving into something she had never anticipated. She was becoming a bridge between two worlds she had tried to keep separate, the world of healing and the world of warriors. The question was no longer whether she could be both a nurse and a protector. The question was how far she was willing to take that dual identity and how many lives she could potentially save by embracing it fully. Standing in that hospital corridor, surrounded by healthcare workers who were still buzzing with excitement about their new capabilities, Sarah began to understand that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons on distant battlefields. Sometimes they were fought with knowledge and skills, empowering ordinary people to protect themselves and others in the places where healing happened. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The only question was how much bigger this mission could become. 6 months after the Tank Rodriguez incident, Sarah stood before an audience of 500 healthcare professionals at the National Healthcare Security Summit in Chicago. The conference had grown out of the success of her program at Metro General, and she was delivering the keynote address on integrated safety training for medical facilities. In the audience, she could see faces from across the country, nurses from rural hospitals in Montana, emergency room doctors from inner-city trauma centers in Detroit, administrators from VA medical centers, and security professionals from hospital systems in every major metropolitan area. When I became a nurse, Sarah began, I thought I was leaving violence behind. I thought I was choosing a profession dedicated entirely to healing and helping others. What I learned was that you can't separate healing from protection. You can't care for others if you can't ensure a safe environment for that care to happen. The projection screen behind her showed before and after statistics from Metro General. Workplace violence incidents had dropped by 73%. Staff turnover in high-risk departments had decreased by 40%. Most importantly, patient satisfaction scores had increased across all departments as staff became more confident and effective in managing difficult situations. The goal was never to turn healthcare workers into security guards, Sarah continued. The goal was to give healers the tools they need to continue healing, even in dangerous circumstances. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Maria Santos, the young nurse who had participated in the first pilot program. Maria was now training other staff members at Metro General and had become one of the program's most effective ambassadors. 6 months ago, Nurse Santos was afraid to work night shifts because of the increased risk of violent incidents. Today, she's not just working those shifts, she's leading a team and training other nurses to feel equally confident and secure. The presentation continued with case studies from 12 hospitals that had implemented variations of Sarah's program. The results were consistently positive. Reduced injuries, improved staff morale, better patient outcomes, and significant cost savings from decreased turnover and workers' compensation claims. During the question-and-answer session, a doctor from a children's hospital in Seattle raised a concern that Sarah had heard repeatedly over the past months. Dr. Martinez, the doctor began, using the title Sarah had earned through her work developing the program. How do we ensure that this training doesn't change the fundamental culture of healthcare? Are we sending the message that patients are potential enemies rather than people we're here to help? It was the crucial question, the one that had kept Sarah awake many nights as she refined the program and watched it spread to other institutions. That's exactly the wrong message, Sarah replied. This training doesn't change our commitment to patients. It enhances our ability to honor that commitment. A healthcare worker who feels safe and confident is better equipped to provide compassionate, effective care. She clicked to a slide showing feedback from patients at hospitals that had implemented the program. Patient satisfaction scores have actually increased in facilities using this training. When staff feel secure, they're more present, more attentive, and more capable of focusing on patient needs rather than personal safety concerns. A nurse from a psychiatric facility in Florida asked the next question. How do you adapt these techniques for patients with mental health conditions without stigmatizing mental illness? Sarah had spent considerable time working with mental health professionals to address this exact concern. Mental illness doesn't equal violence, and our training emphasizes that repeatedly. But mental health crises can sometimes involve unpredictable behavior, and our staff need to know how to respond safely to protect both the patient and themselves. She shared examples of how the program had been adapted for different specialty areas, pediatric units that focused on recognizing signs of child abuse, psychiatric wards that emphasized trauma-informed de-escalation techniques, and emergency departments that dealt with the full spectrum of human crisis. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by dozens of healthcare professionals wanting to implement similar programs in their facilities. But the conversation that mattered most to her was with Dr. Jennifer Chun, who had traveled from Metro General to attend the conference. Sarah, I keep thinking about that night with Tank Rodriguez, Dr. Chun said as they walked through the conference center. If someone had told me 6 months ago that incident would lead to all this, I would never have believed it. They paused at a display showing program implementation statistics. Over 40 hospitals in 15 states were now using some version of Sarah's training program. 3 medical schools had incorporated elements of the curriculum into their standard training. The Veterans Administration had committed to implementing it system-wide. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you had just called security instead of handling the situation yourself, Dr. Chun continued. Tank would have hurt someone, probably seriously. Our staff would have been even more afraid. And thousands of healthcare workers around the country wouldn't have access to this training. Sarah smiled. You're making it sound more heroic than it was. I just did what I was trained to do. That's exactly my point, Dr. Chun replied. You brought training and skills that nobody else in that trauma bay possessed. Now you're making sure that other people have access to similar tools adapted for healthcare settings. Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. Dr. Martinez? I believe we have a meeting scheduled. Sarah turned to see Admiral Webb approaching, still carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She hadn't seen him in person since leaving the Navy, but he looked exactly as she remembered, tall, distinguished, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively straighten their posture. Admiral, it's good to see you, Sarah said, shaking his hand. Dr. Chun, this is Admiral Marcus Webb. Admiral, Dr. Jennifer Chun, my colleague from Metro General. Dr. Chun excused herself, but not before whispering to Sarah, whatever he's offering you, make sure it's worthy of what you've built. The Admiral led Sarah to a quiet corner of the conference center's lounge area. Sarah, I've been following your work over the past 6 months. What you've accomplished is remarkable. He pulled out a tablet and showed her a presentation that looked startlingly familiar. This is the proposal for the National Healthcare Security Initiative. As you can see, it's based heavily on your program at Metro General. Sarah scrolled through the presentation, seeing her own techniques and philosophies adapted for national implementation. Admiral, this looks like my work. It is your work, he confirmed. That's why we need you to lead it. He explained the scope of the proposed program, a joint initiative between the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Defense. The goal was to create standardized safety training for healthcare workers in all federal medical facilities, with the eventual expansion to civilian hospitals nationwide. The position would be based in Washington, but you'd travel extensively. You'd have a team of 25 specialists working under your direction, a budget of $50 million for the first year, and the authority to implement this program in over 200 federal medical facilities. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was describing. Admiral, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something this large. Sarah, 6 months ago you weren't ready to teach 30 people at your own hospital. Today you just gave a keynote address to 500 healthcare professionals, and they hung on every word. Growth happens when we're not ready for it. He leaned forward. I'm not just offering you a job. I'm offering you the chance to transform how this country protects the people who dedicate their lives to healing others. How many healthcare workers could benefit from this training if it were available nationwide? The number was staggering. There were over 6 million healthcare workers in the United States. If even a fraction of them received this training, the impact could be enormous. I need time to think about this, Sarah said finally. Of course. But, Sarah, I want you to understand something. This initiative is going forward with or without you. The question is whether it's going to be led by someone who understands both the military principles behind the training and the healthcare culture it needs to serve. The Admiral stood to leave, then paused. There's one more thing you should know. Tank Rodriguez was arrested again last week. He tried to intimidate a nurse at City General Hospital. But the nurse had been trained in your program. She recognized the threat, de-escalated the situation, and kept everyone safe until security arrived. He handed Sarah a news article about the incident. That nurse credits your training with potentially saving her life. Tank is now looking at federal charges because this was his third assault on a healthcare worker. How many other Tank Rodriguezes are out there? How many nurses like that one could you potentially save? After the Admiral left, Sarah sat alone in the conference center lounge, staring at the article he had given her. The nurse, Jennifer Walsh, was quoted extensively about how the training had given her confidence and tools she never knew she needed. I went from being afraid every time I walked into work to feeling like I could handle whatever came my way, Walsh said in the article. Dr. Martinez's program didn't just teach me techniques. It taught me that I don't have to choose between being a healer and being someone who can protect herself and her patients. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Helen Morrison. Saw your presentation online. Or want to know if you're planning to abandon us for Washington. Please say no. The text was followed by another from Maria Santos. You inspired me to apply for a master's program in healthcare administration. I want to help implement programs like this in underserved hospitals. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Then came one from Tom Harrison. Use the de-escalation techniques you taught us yesterday. Situation that would have required security 6 months ago was resolved peacefully. Patient thanked me afterward. This stuff really works. As the messages continued to come in, Sarah realized that her decision wasn't just about her own career path. It was about the thousands of healthcare workers who were already using these techniques and the millions more who could potentially benefit from them. She thought about the Tank Rodriguez's of the world, people whose violence had been enabled by healthcare workers' inability to protect themselves. She thought about nurses like Jennifer Walsh, whose lives had been changed by access to training that didn't ask them to choose between compassion and safety. Most of all, she thought about the young nurse she had been 8 years ago when she left the military, determined to heal instead of harm. She had thought those were mutually exclusive goals. Now she understood that they could be complementary, that the skills she had learned as a SEAL could serve the mission of healing in ways she had never imagined. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Admiral Webb's number. Admiral, it's Sarah Martinez. I've made my decision about the Washington position. I hope you've decided to accept. I have conditions, Sarah said. I want to maintain my nursing license and continue working with patients at least 1 day a month. I want Metro General to be designated as a pilot site for ongoing program development. And I want Dr. Jennifer Chen appointed as my deputy director. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Those are reasonable conditions. Consider them agreed to. Then, yes, Admiral, I accept. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a strange sense of completion. 8 years ago, she had walked away from military service believing that she was choosing healing over fighting. Now she understood that the most important fight of her life had been to heal, not just individual patients, but an entire profession's ability to provide care safely and confidently. She looked around the conference center where hundreds of healthcare professionals were still networking, sharing ideas, and planning implementations of programs based on her work. In 6 months, this training had grown from a desperate response to a single violent incident to a movement that was changing how healthcare workers thought about their own safety and capabilities. Standing up from the lounge chair, Sarah felt the weight of the responsibility she had just accepted. In a few months, she would be leading a national program that could potentially impact millions of healthcare workers and the patients they served. But as she walked back toward the conference sessions, passing nurses and doctors and administrators who were already planning how to implement safety training in their own facilities, Sarah realized that the real work had already begun. It had started the moment she decided to stop hiding who she was and start using all of her abilities to serve others. The girl who had become a Navy SEAL to serve her country had found a way to continue that service as a nurse. And now, the nurse who had learned to fight was about to teach an entire nation of healers that they didn't have to choose between compassion and strength. In the end, Sarah thought, sometimes the most important battles aren't won with weapons. Sometimes they're won by giving ordinary people the extraordinary tools they need to protect themselves and others. And sometimes the greatest act of healing is teaching others how to heal safely. The ripple effect that had started with Tank Rodriguez's kick in a trauma bay was about to become a wave of change that would wash across every hospital, clinic, and medical facility in the country. And Sarah Martinez, nurse, former Navy SEAL, and reluctant warrior for healthcare workers' safety, would be leading the charge.